During the last decade, Houston, the nation's fourth most populous city, has moved more than 25,000 homeless people directly into apartments and houses. The overwhelming majority of them have remained housed after 2 years. The number of people deemed homeless in the Houston region has been cut by 63% since 2011, according to the latest numbers from local officials. Even judging by the more modest metrics registered in a 2020 federal report, Houston did more than twice as well as the rest of the country at reducing homelessness over the previous decade. 10 years ago, homeless veterans, one of the categories that the federal government tracks, waited 720 days and had to navigate 76 bureaucratic steps to get from the street into permanent housing with support from social service counselors. Today, a streamlined process means the wait for housing is 32 days. Houston has gotten this far by teaming with county agencies and persuading scores of local service providers, corporations and charitable nonprofits, organizations that often bicker and compete with one another, to row in unison. Together, they've gone all in on housing first, a practice, supported by decades of research, that moves the most vulnerable people straight from the streets into apartments, not into shelters, and without first requiring them to wean themselves off drugs or complete a 12-step program or find God or a job. There are addiction recovery and religious conversion programs that succeed in getting people off the street. But housing first involves a different logic. When you're drowning, it doesn't help if your rescuer insists you learn to swim before returning you to shore. You can address your issues once you're on land. Or not. Either way, you join the wider population of people battling demons behind closed doors. A decade ago, Houston had one of the highest per capita homeless counts in the country. Its homeless response system was in shambles. The city was squandering millions of public dollars and police officers' time by jailing homeless Houstonians for intoxication. Residents living on the streets, under bridges and along the bayous were using ambulances to get basic medical care because they had no other way to do so. Before I leave office, I want Houston to be the first big city to end chronic homelessness, Sylvester Turner told me. In late January, Mr. Turner, who is serving his final term as mayor, joined Harris County leaders in unveiling a $100 million plan that would use a mix of federal, state, county and city funds to cut the local homeless count in half again by 2025. Mr. Turner chose his words with care, and it's important to parse his phrasing. Chronic homelessness is a term of art. It refers to those people, like many in the Houston encampment, who have been living on the streets for more than a year or who have been homeless repeatedly, and who have a mental or physical disability. Nationwide, most of those who experience homelessness do not fall into that narrow category. They are homeless for 6 weeks or fewer. 40% have a job. For them, homelessness is an agonizing but temporary condition that they manage to resolve, maybe by doubling up with relatives or friends. Encampments like the one in the underpass lay bare decades of calamitous decisions by planners, politicians and health and housing authorities. 1 in every 14 Americans experiences homelessness at some point, a population that is disproportionately black. Eradicating homelessness would involve tackling systemic racism, reconstituting the nation's mental health, family support and substance abuse systems, raising wages, expanding the federal housing voucher program and building millions more subsidized homes. The goal in Houston and among other cities attacking the problem is different. To make homelessness only rare and brief, to cite Roseanne Haggerty, the housing advocate. 5 states, California, New York, Florida, Washington and Texas, now account for 57% of the people experiencing homelessness. Not coincidentally, it is worst in those big cities where affordable housing is in short supply. The so-called NIMBYs are powerful, and the yawning gap between median incomes and the cost of housing keeps growing. Houston fits that description. The scale of its woes does not approach what is happening in San Francisco, New York or Los Angeles. But the progress it has made in housing people is instructive and replicable. It constitutes a fragile, compelling success. By mid-afternoon on that July day, Ms. Rausch's team had transferred those living in the encampment to their new residences. Among the people relocated was a shy, 39-year-old woman named Terry Harris. Ms. Harris had leapt at the prospect of an apartment when outreach workers approached her in the camp. She was tired of living on the streets, but, above all, she was desperate to reunite with her 3-year-old daughter, Blessed, whom she had had to leave with her sister. Two outreach workers packed Ms. Harris into a white van, along with a hefty trash bag stuffed with household supplies and a Bible. Ms. Harris looked nervous but smiled as the van drove off. The stage was set with the shuttering of psychiatric hospitals in the wake of abuse scandals and the introduction of new psychotropic medications. Then cities started offering tax incentives to owners of flophouses, or single-room occupancy hotels, to convert their properties into market-rate rentals, condos and co-ops. In New York City alone, more than 100,000 SRO units that had housed substance abusers, elderly singles, former inmates and the mentally ill were lost. During the 1980s, back-to-back recessions, combined with the Reagan administration's severe federal cutbacks targeting low-income housing and poverty assistance programs, forced more and more Americans, including large numbers of families, into homelessness. At the same time, well-paid manufacturing jobs moved overseas, and steelworkers had to start pushing brooms at McDonald's. An oil crisis drove up fuel prices, which bumped up rents, as did a new generation of gentrifiers discovering the architectural pleasures of historic neighborhoods. On top of all that, Reagan-era tax reforms encouraged the construction of high-end, single-family homes but not of affordable multifamily rentals. There were 515,000 multifamily homes built in America in 1985, but just 140,000 built in 1991. As people began competing for fewer and fewer apartments, the affordable housing market turned into a game of musical chairs played by low-income Americans. Someone always lost. Jessica Preheim, the vice president for strategic planning at Houston's Coalition for the Homeless and one of Ms. Rausch's colleagues, remembers that every 5 or 6 years the Houston Housing Authority would announce a lottery for anyone hoping to get on the waiting list for federal housing vouchers. As Ms. Preheim recalls, if you wanted to enter the lottery, you needed first to hear the announcement, then submit an application in writing within a few days, before the lottery closed. If, by some miracle, your name were drawn, you would receive notification by snail mail, which, of course, required a street address. Thou Costas, who runs a homeless service provider in Houston called Search, said that back then her organization, like many in the city, was trying to do everything: outreach, case management, child services, employment training, paying rent to landlords to house clients. Search was $1 million in the hole, Ms. Costas remembers, and the people who most needed help weren't getting it. Atlanta, too, was adrift until neighboring counties dropped out of a joint continuum and the city set up its own, modeling its approach on Houston's. Atlanta has since cut its homeless numbers by 40% and gained increasing corporate support, a vital source of additional funding. When you get the public sector aligned, it becomes much easier to go to the private sector and say, "Join us," Catherine Vassell, who runs Atlanta's Continuum, told me. Getting businesses squarely behind solutions to homelessness, beyond their usual token contributions, is clearly a challenge in other places. In 2020, city councilors in Seattle approved a tax on businesses to support homeless housing. But the councilors rescinded the tax less than a month later in the face of opposition from big employers, including Amazon, which temporarily halted construction of a downtown tower in protest. Corporate leaders explained that they didn't trust the city to spend the money effectively. As a consequence of Houston's more united front, city officials were able to channel private money and federal emergency relief dollars in the wake of Hurricane Harvey, in 2017, to help supercharge the housing of unhoused Houstonians. And now COVID money, which other cities have spent on temporary shelters and hotel rooms, is paying the rent for thousands of apartments for